My Subnautica fan film Ascension took almost 2 years of full-time work. This project stretched my abilities as an artist further than ever before, and as a result, I learnt so many new tips and techniques that I'd love to share with you in this video. So let's get into how I created Ascension, a Subnautica fan film. I've never played a game as captivating and immersive as Subnautica. I first played this gem in 2018 when I was in my second last year of high school. Art was one of my electives, and so I decided to create a short film based off the game. I decided I'd post it to YouTube and didn't really think twice about it, but it surprised me when the video started to gain traction, and now it's amassed almost 1 million views, which is just insane. I created Unknown Waters on a 2012 Mac Mini, and since then I've upgraded building my own PC with a 12-core AMD processor and a NVIDIA 3060 Ti. What's most important is now I had access to proper rendering engines such as Arnold and Redshift. There were so many comments asking for a sequel to Unknown Waters, so I decided to go all in and make this my most ambitious project yet. And with the announcement of Subnautica Below Zero, I wanted to include some Arctic biomes as well in the film, so it was a bit of a challenge working out how I would integrate the two in the duration of a short film. These are the original first storyboards that I used to fabricate the plot of the film. I wanted to showcase the most important moments from the game, including discovering the Aurora, getting cured, and launching the rocket. And so that led me to the idea of the Aurora actually landing in Sector 0. I figured it was plausible that the life pods ejected before the captain had time to change the Aurora's trajectory to Sector 0. And from there it was just about working out what happened in between. Subnautica is basically a horror game, so I wanted to have some tense and scary sequences as well. Here are some more shots of my storyboards. You can see the raw and often messy process that I use to brainstorm ideas. This is how I work. Once storyboarding's done, it was time to get a mood board together. This mostly consisted of concept art by Pat Presley and Corey Strader. I wanted the film to contain some visuals that didn't make it into the original game, and so looking at the original concept art was a brilliant way for me to do this. In fact, some of these shots and compositions are directly inspired by pieces of concept art. Now that I had visual inspiration and a storyline as well, it was time to commence work on the 3D assets. Funnily enough, the first asset I created is actually the last one that appears in the film. It's the Neptune escape rocket. I'm using Cinema 4D as my weapon of choice, but literally any 3D program such as Blender or Maya is able to achieve similar or even better results than what I'm doing here. I'm not an expert modeler by any means, and so some of the techniques I'm using here aren't really advisable for proper productions. However, they worked for what I needed to do and allowed me to iterate really quickly. I had the rocket and the launch pad in the same scene, just so I could make sure the scale was all correct and everything would fit properly. I mainly use edge loops and booleans to create extra detail, as well as subdivision surfaces just to smooth everything out. But what good is a model without textures? After UV unwrapping, I brought it into Substance Painter and started handcrafting the texture. Here I'm adding normal map stencils, which are a really great way to add extra details without having to model extra geometry. These are basically just flat textures that create the illusion of depth by modifying the surface normals of the object. Now we have the Sea Emperor Leviathan. This is in Mudbox, which is a sculpting program. I started out with a basic cube and then subdivided that and started adding extra bits and details. I've got symmetry on, so everything that I do to one side is represented on the other exactly, which saves so much time and allows the model to be symmetrical, which is super handy for animation. One thing to note is I modeled the torso and the tentacles separately, because it's so much easier to animate the tentacles when it's not connected to the main body. And we can now give it some life by creating some eyes. Those eyelids are probably the most crucial part, as they'll be animated later and really help convey the emotion and depth in the character. It's now time to texture the Sea Emperor, so I'm using Substance Painter for this, where I'm starting off with a few base materials with some masks to determine where certain materials should go. I'm adding a luminous texture for the eyes there, just to give it that signature Sea Emperor glow. And I'm also using symmetry here, just like in Mudbox, so I don't have to repeat the same thing on both sides. And I'm using a layer with a negative height, just painting on some extra details. And we add another emissive material for the antennas there, using a mask. And for the inside of the mouth, I painted that black because it's pretty nasty and so it hides it. So I'm just continuing to add extra details to the mesh. Also, I forgot to mention, but I did UV unwrap this through Mudbox. And I'm actually hand painting some of these shell detailing. I think it goes a long way into making the final result look a lot better. This is the final stage of the texturing, where I'm adding in some darker materials and blending it just to add some contouring. And I'm using a dirt stencil there, you can see, just to paint some dark spots on the texture and break up the uniformity. And now we're on to the signature Seamoth. I'm not going to go into too much depth on this one, because I've already done that in a previous video, which you can check out right here. And here's the Cyclops, which is an important one because lots of the film takes place in this. So I started out with a basic cylinder there, just using soft selection and pushing and pulling there to create the contours. Once again, I'm using symmetry, so it saves a lot of time and ensures the model is nice and even. Now let's add some windows using a boolean there, just cutting in. And finally a boolean for the main window. This is one of the main assets for the film, so I wanted to make sure it was nice and high quality. And now it's time to add some propellers at the back here. So basic tubes, one scaled up larger than the other, and then placing some cubes to act as the fins. And now I'm modeling a propeller shape, which I'm then going to clone 5 times to make the final propeller. Now we need an interior, so I'm using a cube there with a figure for reference for scale. And I'm using edge loops and extruding there to create the front rim. And then I'm using the volume builder to create that nice round cutout at the top. And then I'm adding in a capsule for the light. And now we're texturing again inside of Substance Painter. I did this all hand painted with perspective and symmetry. If I were to do this again, I would have properly UV unwrapped that back face and then done it, say, inside of Photoshop, where it would allow me to do it in a 2D view, which would have made it so much easier than trying to hand paint everything in perspective. These are just a few miscellaneous assets that I worked on. There's the blood kelp and the ghost tree and the ghost Leviathan as well. So really fun texture work. The final asset I'm going to be showing today is the Sea Emperor Leviathan Juvenile. This was an asset I created right towards the end of the film when I received feedback that it wasn't clear that I'd been cured from the disease. So that meant I needed to create a sequence with the juvenile spitting out the enzyme and then me touching the enzyme and getting cured. I'd originally tried just downloading the side view of the juvenile and then trying to animate that using the puppet tools in After Effects, but it looked really shocking, and so I figured I'd just create the whole asset in 3D. Unlike the previous Sea Emperor asset, which was only a torso, this one had the tentacles connected, and so I decided to model it using traditional box modeling. And then I created a skeleton using joints for animation. Next in Mudbox, I'm adding some extra details, so sculpting in that face, and an extremely dodgy mouth. I probably should have modeled that in cinema. Again, just adding some details with symmetry there, adding those eyelids for expression, and then sculpting in those plate shell details, which was super fun. And then I sculpted in some bulbs for the tentacles and added some extra details on those arms. And now we're back in Substance Painter, where I'm using 2 different materials there to start off with, adding in some emissive eyes, and then kind of sculpting in some more details. Texturing's my favorite part, as I'm using a Wacom stylus and it's just super fun chilling out and drawing these textures onto these characters and really bringing them to life. Substance Painter allows you to use a black and white image as a mask for materials, and so I created a shell looking texture, which are those dark spots you can see there. It really helps add extra detail, and then I'm adding these emissive bulbs that go down the body towards the tentacles. Now it's time for the finishing touches, just adding some blemishes and imperfections to the texture, just to give it some more grit and realism. And then we're going to import it back into Cinema, where I'm making a selection and cloning on these bulbs. And then I'm going to collapse all of those little clones and the main mesh into one single model so I can animate it as a whole. And there you can see I'm adjusting the bones to fit the final rig, and then I'm weighing out those joints as well just to make sure there's no issues with the animation. And then some pose morphs for the facial animation, like the mouth and the eyelids. And then I just tested out the final look in Redshift and making that emissive yellow texture. So that wraps up part 1 of the behind the scenes of Ascension. Get keen for next week's episode where I'll be discussing the environment creation and previs animation of the film. That's it from me. Have a great weekend.